I would now like to welcome our moderator, Dr. Yelina Trakoulia, to the stage. She is the Senior Advisor for Academic and Cultural Affairs with Qatar Museums, and she's the Editorial Director of this forum. She will introduce her panel on Agent of Change, How Design Shapes Society and Culture.
Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to announce the panel for today. We will begin in the middle with Timothy Marlو, who is a British writer, broadcaster, and art historian. And he's also a director and chief executive of the Design Museum London. He's an art critic and presenter, widely known for Channel 5 show Marlو on Style and the ITV series Great Art. Ibrahim Jeyda almost doesn't need any introduction, but I have to say that you're an award-winning Qatari architect, group CEO, and chief architect of the Arab Engineering Bureau. He is the author of Qatari Style, History of Qatari Architecture, and most recently, Discovering Arab Deco, and a designer of numerous notable buildings in Qatar. David Shipperfield is a celebrated British architect, founder of David Shipperfield Architects. He curated Venice Biennale in 2012. He is the designer of some of the world's most iconic buildings and the recipient of the Pritzker Prize for Architecture in 2023. Please help me welcome our panel. So our topic for today is Agent of Change, how design shapes society and culture. And I thought we should begin with a few visual examples to introduce us to the topic, and then after that we will engage in a discussion. So we will begin with you, Tim, and your slides.
Okay.
No, you have 3 for this one.
You'll do 3. I just want to stand, because what I was asked to do, what we've all been asked to do, is to choose an image of a design that's fundamentally changed the world. And we're going to wrestle with that later, and that's a really difficult subject. So I chose this, which is a wall at the Design Museum. It's the finale of a collection based around 3 themes: designer, maker, user. In other words, how things are made, how they're used, and what the inspiration or motivation was to make them. And this is this kind of diagrammatic wall where it looks like a mess, and I can't photograph it from a distance, but imagine this is the center. And what you have here are a whole range of different design technologies. So this is television, and you'll all recognize the classic Arthur Brace girdle image from 1968, a kind of Scandi lunar plastic modernist casing with a functioning color TV inside it. That category is mine, by the way. But then you look at MP3 players, vinyl players. On the other wall, you look at telephones, calendars, pens. You see where this is going. And in the end, everything converges in the middle on this, which is the smartphone. And this is actually the prototype from 2007. You all know it was Johnny Ive, but it was Johnny Ive and the Apple design team, so it's a collective, collaborative effort. So what am I saying? Am I saying that the smartphone is the design that changed the world in this instance? To some extent, yeah. It's a convergence of all these things. It's rendered some of these technologies obsolete, almost. It's made us have a new category of object, the smartphone. But it's also a symptomatic of escalating production and consumption, because this is in 2007, and in 2024, we're already on the 15th iteration and waiting with bated breath for the 16th iteration of the smartphone. When I was growing up, even as a child, the telephone that we had in our house, or the 2 of them, were rented from a state-organized telephone company. The camera that my father took the first photographs of my brother and I, he'd had since he was a teenager, and it lasted him all his life. The typewriter that he wrote his essays or sermons on, he was a man of the church, he had that all his working life. All of us in this room will be replacing all those objects, probably annually, if not monthly. And that's the difference, in a sense. So yeah, it's a design that's changed the world, but it's symptomatic of the issues around design at the moment, which is what the purpose of design is, problem solving, but what problems design also creates. And that's what we're going to wrestle with, I hope, today, and certainly what we're wrestling with at the museum.
And please do not sit down, because you have one more example. The assignment was find something that has changed the culture, and then find something that you think is going to change the culture as of now.
Okay, I'll be really quick now. Sorry, because we've got to be brief. You've got really distinguished people to hear. So this is part of a project at the Design Museum called Future Observatory, which we may talk about later. We are now the centre of design research for the green transition for the UK. We have money to distribute to design research projects and postgraduate organisations. And this is the kind of research that we're able to help facilitate or showcase in the museum. We're hoping we can deal with massive issues like single-use plastic in the National Health Service. But this is a good example because it's very specific, and you'll see the change that it can make because it exists. So this is a tunic designed by a company called Favour Futures, run by an inspiring Zimbabwean-born Scottish architectural trained woman called Natsai Audrey Chiesa, who collaborated with a company she set up with the biolabs at University College in London. And this is a tunic made of material that is made of micro-dyed fabric. There is no water involved in the production of this fabric. It's done through micro-dyeing. Therefore, if this can be produced not at industrial scale, but certainly on a larger scale than one item of clothing, and it's actually moving into commercial production, it means that the implications for everything we're wearing in the room, some of us more garish than others, requires huge amounts of water in the dyeing of the fabrics that we wear. This reduces that. So this is a very specific, small-scale, but important example of how good design and research and collaboration can make a difference.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. Now we will turn towards architecture and urban design.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I'll do the same thing. Well, in a couple of slides, I will mention what I had in mind, but looking at a nation and transformation, 30s and beyond that, after the thriving pearl diving era, which was a golden age in its own right, then comes the artificial pearl, so the whole region got bankrupt. Difficult times, then the oil struck, and the transformation has started, began. I like that picture because it reminds me of the gold rush, a beginning of transformation, a very fast transformation. So we look at an identity, an aesthetical identity, a culture, and how can it transform so rapidly into something, a totally different definition. Where did we take our identity, our culture, yet transformed it into a very vernacular, contemporary architecture, which I think the dialogue now is going to address some of these issues. Yet, with all this transformation, we still maintain our identity, we still dressed up with the same clothing, speak the same accent, and proud of what we have achieved in this transformation. And this is something, a dialogue that hopefully is going to arise now.
Thank you, Ibrahim. And I will put the slide for you, David.
I'm sitting on my bench.
I sit at your knees.
Design is not very good here.
So we were asked to discuss agents of change and the idea of, what's next, in a way, what's going to change our world, as if there is a continuum of progress. And as Tim said very succinctly, in a way, we've seen progress gravitate in a certain way. I'm old enough to have seen this progress in a very explicit way. I was born in the 1950s. We didn't have much in those days, and we've seen an enormous transformation of society where, in a way, some of us have too much. But most importantly, I think we've changed a little bit our idea of what progress is itself. For the first time in my life, I would say there's a certain loss of confidence in the absolute notion of progress and what progress is. And I think even within Tim's introduction, there is, I think, a sort of anxiety of where this goes, because if we take the iPhone itself, this climax of technical progress, we are now struggling with the consequences of that in terms of its abuse, in terms of social media, what's happening to pedophilia, and all sorts of, so it's a mixed notion of progress. And this is a strange moment in that sense, because my whole life I always thought progress was good. In the 60s we got the Beatles, and we got fashion. In London we got food for the first time, decent food. We got design. Everything just got better and better until it sort of got worse. And now this insecurity we have, what do we talk about? Cultural heritage, identity, the problems of globalism. All of these things are expressions of anxiety. Because in theory, what is wrong with globalism? The sharing of intelligence, the sharing of common ends. The anxiety of globalism is the consequences of globalism in terms of consumerism, in terms of what it's doing to our resource, and what's putting a moment on that is what it's doing to climate. And this has given us, in a way, a red light that we could sense for a long time, but now we know that we can't see progress anymore in the same way. So all of a sudden, we are starting to think progress in a different way. We are looking at how we grow our food. We're going back to processes of wilding our nature, in a way, undoing things. So I find myself at this point in my career spending more and more time, or let me say, put it another way, less and less time on architectural objects, although it's still one of the great treats we have as architects to design buildings. I wouldn't advocate against that. But I think what we're starting to understand better is that as architects and planners, we can actually contribute much more to the common good as opposed to the idea of making things for a sector of society. I found myself in the last 10 years, well, for the last 30 years, I've been in this small community in northern Spain. In the last 10 years, I've been working for the regional government. And this is the project that we've just finished. It took 6 years to build a stone bench. In a way, one of the most insignificant things I've ever built physically. But the bench is a consequence of 4 or 5 years working with a community, discussing with them how we might move their cars, because moving cars, stopping people parking cars is one of the most difficult challenges. But actually working with a community, trying to find a resolution between those things which are common, shared, public space, dealing with things which, in a way, are much more to do with securing quality of life. And in that process, it forces us to rethink what is progress. In this case, progress, strangely, is about rethinking where we park our car. We allowed the car free license for too long. In most of our towns, they've ruined the town. I think it's very nice in this area. I must say it's really impressive how you have the sense that the environment of this particular quarter is somehow balanced between the car and urban space. So my contribution to this discussion is not a contribution as to what object is next, or what architectural fashion is next, or what next design fashion is next, but a rethinking of architecture and design not as products, but as process. That the way we engage community, the way we collaborate together, the way we see the consequence of actions as something which is fundamental. If we have a circular economy, we have to think about circular planning. We can't do things without looking at the consequence of that. And over these last years, we have dismantled that process. And I think this is the plea I would make, or the change that I would talk about, which is the way that we prioritize, the way we work together, and how we see design not as an object, but as an activity, as a process.
Tim, if you can. This actually is a great introduction. We were just talking, Tim mentioned something about design and how design is not about objects. Do you feel that it echoes the same sentiment that David just espoused?
I really do. I mean, I came from the art world to a museum of design where, if I say it's the fetishization of objects, maybe that's overstating the case, but museums want to collect and we want things. And we have to work out what the criteria are for those things. But the incremental nature and momentum about the production of objects in the world has kind of forced a sense of crisis. You're right, it's anxiety, it is bordering on crisis. But actually, design is collaborative, and design is fundamentally a process, as David said. And if you try and define design like you try and define art, we can always knock that back. But I'm going to have a crack. Fundamentally, design is about problem solving. That could be aesthetic, it could be formal, it could be functional, it could be matters of taste, it could be matters of economics. But design tends to exist in the idea of commission, collaboration with capital, but also collaboration amongst creative individuals. And therefore, emphatically, yeah, I agree. It's not that we shouldn't be looking at objects, it's not that objects shouldn't be produced. But I think if we get obsessed with design as simply being about that, we lose sight of most of what it is. And design is really interesting in the context of not just this conversation, but of Doha, where we are now. Because design, I mean, I'm not a poacher turned gamekeeper fully. I believe art's importance, I believe art has this transformative potential to change the way we see the world, and that means a lot to me. My heart's probably still there. But design is so fundamentally important in the way our world is. But it gets kicked on one level because it's merely functional. It's merely a response to a problem. And then it gets kicked on another level because it is seen as elitist or luxury or fueling mass consumption. It does both, but actually its importance and the fact that design may have helped get us into the kind of mess we are in relationship to our planet, design and human ingenuity, which is what design is, will get us, that's the way we're going to get out of it if we're going to get out of it, and I believe we are. That was a very long-winded answer to a simple question, I apologise, but I do think there is a sense of trying to understand that it is more than stuff. It's a way of thinking.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you, Ibrahim, and connecting a little bit to these thoughts of what is changing and how, I wanted to press you a bit on the relationship between tradition and modernity. As an architect with a deep appreciation for cultural heritage, how do traditional design elements influence your work in contemporary architecture? And how has appreciation of design evolved in Qatar and the region over the course of time?
Well, throughout my own career, tradition at the beginning, I was re-exploring. I think it was more of an obstacle, and that's why I always advise the young students, tradition is something that can inspire us, but it's not the chain in our brain that will make us get stuck into a certain period of the history. But however, there is so much we can learn from tradition. Considering that our ancestors managed to live in such a harsh environment without electricity, without anything, there was a genius solution into this built environment. It's interesting, we did a Harvard study and they did a simulation to the old neighborhood, and the temperature was 10 to 12 degrees less inside the courtyards and so on. And I guess there is no, David and I, when we were crossing for coffee, across the street, we were appreciating the surrounding. And I think the lessons learned in this contemporary, modern part of our city, lessons learned from the past, what we learned from these built environment and reflected this in a contemporary way. Smaller windows, the orientation, every breeze will make a difference. And I think this is where we should take our lessons learned from our culture into a more suitable environment to our existing life. And with the globalization, we're utilizing the latest technologies, whether it's the mechanical systems or the construction method, to translate that lessons learned of our tradition into the most contemporary living spaces, comfortable, belongs to this nature and to this environment.
David, many cultural institutions have chosen your designs to express how they see themselves or what they stand for or aspire to be. If design and architecture have the capacity to communicate ideas, give identity to these institutions, do they also have the capacity to change culture?
Well, Winston Churchill, amongst many things he said that we shape our buildings and our buildings shape us. And there's a certain obvious truth in that. But when we say we shape the buildings, who is we? And what are the forces that shape that? And as Tim said, architecture and design is a collaborative process. To some degree, there's been too much emphasis on the designer and the architect as the solution to things. I mean, we are only tools. We can only help shape and direct forces, but we can't invent those forces. So, and it's the same with architecture. I think we're at a point now where we have to have more consideration about not how we solve a particular problem, but whether that problem is the right problem in the first place. As architects, we tend to be, and designers, we're at the very end of a food chain. By the time the task arrives to us, it's pretty well defined. It's an office building, it's here, it's 23 stories, it sits within a red line, and the budget is this. But maybe it's necessary to go further up the food chain and question, is that the right place to build an office? Should this single action be carried out? And again, I think it was really interesting walking around here. I think this is a very impressive, let's say, architectural environment. And not because of the architecture, or not because of the statements that the architectural projects do, but the feeling, the totality of it. Actually, probably one by one, you could argue that the architecture is quite unexciting. But I would say the collaboration of the buildings together has a coherence, which is really, I think, impressive. And then Ibrahim is saying, how much do we learn from heritage, but also how much do we learn from other efforts? It's very interesting to compare this urban idea with the urban idea of the commercial center of Doha, the city of towers, where there isn't the sense of urbanism in the same way. When you think about this area, it's a really interesting critique of that area. And what an amazing progress. I think it's very difficult for us only to see heritage as some sort of solution, as if it's, well, if we can put heritage on top of it, everything's fine. If we can put place on top of it, and can put context. So you don't have to change your way of thinking. You just have to have a different set of things in your pocket. And in that sense, I'm worried about using words loosely, like identity, heritage. We have to be very careful about that. In the same way, we have to be a little bit careful about the negatives, globalism and consumerism and da-da-da. We have to be much more precise about the negatives and positives. As I said in the beginning, I think globalism is an issue. Not in essence, because surely we should be sharing knowledge, we should be sharing experience, we should be sharing cultures in a global way. But we have to reconsider what the unintended consequences of globalism is doing in terms of production, in terms of how we are eroding resources, how we are shipping things from one part of the planet to the other. All of a sudden, we are really able to think about localism as a concept for the first time, because localism would have been seen before this crisis as protectionism. And now we can actually embrace localism not as a negative thing, and not in denial of globalism, but as a qualification of that. And I think this is the challenge of our time. Not to deny technology, but to qualify what technology is doing. Not to deny globalism, but to qualify what globalism can give us. And I do believe, I'm sounding pessimistic, but I'm extremely optimistic, because I think the climate crisis, and to some degree, and just as important, the crisis of inequality, is forcing us to take much more seriously these questions of environment, physical, natural, and social.
I wish I could disagree with you because it makes for a better discussion, but sadly I don't. But I think there is a kind of nuance underpinning that. There was a discussion yesterday about tradition. David Lilly was involved in it. And actually, it was really striking to me how working with traditional materials, using traditional techniques, isn't heritage industry wearing it as a kind of badge of honour or virtue signalling. There's much to be learnt or relearned. We have a display at the museum which looks at low carbon housing issues, 3 practices, each working in contemporary ways with stones, straw and wood, like the 3 little piggies, but looking at local materials as to how you might build buildings. And the only reason why mass development can't start to use mid-rise or high-rise wooden buildings made of cross-laminate timber, for example, I mean, there are buildings, War Thistleton have done it, is because the algorithms of the insurance companies in the UK, after Grenfell, won't insure a high-rise building in wood, even though it is less likely to burn than a clad concrete and steel building. So I kind of agree with you, but there's a nice link as well, I think, to Ibrahim's work, which is, although your stadium, which I think is wonderful, is a statement building, I mean, that's what sporting arenas are, I love the way it both references local tradition, but also uses techniques, how one crochets and knits a particular piece of headwear, and can reconfigure that idea to make a building. And then you were telling me earlier that that building as well, it wasn't just you authoring it. You actually had many, many different architectural consultants where the sun was, what's the best way of seating. And that seems a much so it seems to me a kind of an amazing mixture of how we might make something more sustainable and in a more collaborative way, even if it is a statement building. Although obviously a kind of wooden stadium might be, certainly in the UK, using local materials, or the shipping container stadium here. I always forget the number, 876 or whatever it is, but 974, thank you. Thank you very much. But what a brilliant idea that is, where it can be built, taken down, put elsewhere, and so on. So I suppose there's kind of agreement in that, but there are kind of nuances as to how we might use tradition and learn from it, rather than, as you said, David, just putting it as a kind of decorative afterthought that then affirms identity at the last minute, and that really isn't the way forward.
Should I comment? I mean,
of course.
I think this is getting exciting. A question maybe we should ask ourselves, does identity and tradition evolve? It does. There are fixed items. I'm from this region, maybe this is my background, but I think we evolve. And I think the examples we've seen, how our cities evolved wherever we are from. And it's a question we always have to ask, how much can we evolve without losing who we are? But it's healthy to evolve. And this globalization, how we can make benefit of it. I mean, this collaboration was an exciting thing. And the stadium that I had the pleasure of designing while I was designing the aesthetics, but we had a Spanish guy who was doing the FIFA compliance. So he knows about the seat, the angle, the sizes. A German guy was helping me make the skin work, making the gafia works structurally. And the list goes on, 17 different, and that's making use of the globalization, using these technologies, but still reflecting some sort of an evolved identity or reflecting a personality in a way that can be conceived by everybody coming.
Technology, again, is giving us all sorts of benefits. One of the things we can do now is to calculate the performance of buildings, which we couldn't do before. Now we can design a building and we can see what its energetic performance will be. We can calculate its embedded CO2, things which would have just been so difficult to calculate before. Now we can get that evidence. We can work out how many cars are moving from one place to another at any particular point in the day. So when someone says no one goes on those streets, or they do go on there, we actually can get to that information very quickly. We don't have to sit somebody on the street with a little board. So there are, we have to, again, I would say there's nothing wrong with technology, there's nothing wrong with globalism, it's just how we use them. And in the same way, we have to be careful about our romantic idea of traditions as well. We have to be rigorous about that. We did a 2-year study in our region. My group, we went into the hill. We were romantically attracted to the idea of communities that were still working in very small holdings. They own their own common land. It's called a common land. So 38% of Galicia is in common land ownership. And we read from an environmentalist that this is the future. That having land in common ownership and farming it together is so we were very excited. And we projected our romantic expectations on this. Of course, when we interviewed 58 different people who lived in the hills, they just told us how difficult it was, what a difficult life it is, how they wanted their children to go away and study in universities and things like that. It was a really important thing to understand both sides of that story. So we can't just turn the clock back. We can't just adopt ideas of heritage or romantic notions of tradition. We have to think about what was at the base of that. And I think it's just to do with how do we learn from the past and how do we use the anxieties that we correctly have at the moment in terms of how we use resources, how we use energy, how we use technology. And I think it puts us, in an extraordinary time of history, because before we just thought technology just brings us. We don't have to worry about it. We can get onto the moon. Technology would always deliver us into a better place. And for the first time, we've started to think, oh, actually, it put us in a rather difficult place. Now we have to think how to get out of it, the problems it's caused, or problems we have caused ourselves by our misappropriation of those tools.
It's so interesting that the theme here seems to emerge about anxiety, and this reminds me of late 19th century France and decadence and sense that everything is going to the dogs. But I'm interested from this perspective you have here in Doha and having lived here for many years. I don't have this sense that there is an anxiety. If anything, there is maybe that doubt about globalization. For instance, you said somewhere that architecture cannot be globalized. And when we talked, you said architecture has been globalized. Why is globalization as such so important as a concept? And why is there such a big tension, whether there is or there isn't globalization?
It's fairly obvious what we're worried about when we use these words in this loose way, because in a way it's an impossible thing to talk about. You can't put the genie back into the bottle. What are the negatives of globalization? Cities which all look the same, buildings which look the same, and the moving of materials from one side of the planet to the other for no real reason apart from the notion of some sort of global imitation of product. And as Tim says, the legislation of buildings and also the investment market forces of buildings is what produces most buildings. They're not being, London has transformed itself in our lifetime. No? In the last 20 years, it's changed totally. Friends of mine will say, why are we building all of these buildings on the south bank of the river? I have no idea. Well, you must know, you're an architect. No, I have no idea. Who is building them? Investment. It's not, we used to build towns and villages because we needed those buildings. Now there are forces, global forces of investment, which is, in a way, the energy that produces those buildings. Now, that doesn't mean it's all wrong. It just means that we have to consider how to contain those forces, because it's an issue of scale and containment and restriction. The world used to have a scale because we could only do things of a certain scale. We could only build things of a certain scale. We could only make decisions of a certain scale. The problem is not what we're doing, it's the scale of the operation and how we do that. When we do redevelopment, the scale of planning is often so insensitive to how we live, because scale's got nothing to do with us. The scale's got to do with the operation of redevelopment itself. And how do you retrofit our scale. And that was a little bit my bench thing, at the end of my life, but towards...
as you reach maturity.
In the maturing years of my professional career, I get enormous satisfaction of having a village as my client, a community as my client, or something, and trying to find physical resolution in a way, capturing common concerns and concerns that might improve quality of life or secure quality of life. Because I would say, as architects, we have been part of, in the last 30 or 40 years, a process which has not necessarily improved our cities, has made our cities more expensive to the point at which most people can no longer afford to live in them. So we've done a sort of social cleansing on cities like London, Paris, Zurich. Everybody has to live on the outside. We've been part of that. We're part of an industry which is responsible for 42% of CO2 production, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it's time, I think, we've tried to find a way back into a less victimized notion that we don't, it's not us, Gov, because we are somehow involved in it. And I do believe that architects and designers, we've been trained in a lateral way, we've been trained to see the consequence of things, and we've been trained to believe that there's a balance between the physical ideas of architecture and design and the social meaning of architecture and design. And that balance is not often there, and I think that's the balance that we all pine for, and I think the next generation has to insist on.
I think the whole idea of taste is really important in this regard. I mean, the globalization, to give an example of why globalism, when it's bad, is a high-rise in London was put up, and actually similarly a high-rise with mirrored glass was put up in Texas. Both were just sort of like TARDIS-like, supplanted in a city. Both of them nearly caused cars to catch fire. I mean, so, and from Ibrahim's perspective, the idea that you consult and you're looking at the position, and that's good globalization. Or rather, it's localized globalization, where you're specifically looking at the individual problems and context and making an appropriate building. Whereas when everything's sort of dropped in, there's clearly issues. But not to be British obsessed, but 30, 40 years ago, through a lobby of conservative conservationists, any major high-rise or any major modernist building, it wasn't always high-rise, Mies van der Rohe, for example, weren't allowed to happen. Now, we have a lot of very bad modernist, late modernist, as well as postmodernist buildings going up with unregulated sort of developers doing what they do. But adaptive reuse, which is what David's done at the NED, and the idea of conserving buildings, but in a contemporary way, clearly is a more sustainable way of being in the future. But there's a balance between the two, which are part of Ibrahim's practice. And surely trying to, I mean, I don't mean this in a kind of patrician way, but educating or trying to shift public taste is critical in this regard. It's the same with design as well, across the board. That if we want reused plastic to make furniture, we want to find ways of reusing plastic, we have to move away from the obsession with perfect monochrome material and actually have something that looks like the Play-Doh that we all had as children when it all got amalgamated in the same box. We have to learn to shift our taste from whatever the notions of good taste are at the moment, like having a suit with a kind of garish fabric on it. There has to be different ways of being, and post-modernity surely ought to have a greater pluralism of prevailing taste that should allow these things to happen, but often it doesn't.
So it goes back to your original question, is design an agent of taste? And to some degree, what Tim is saying, it can't change society without society also being part of that change. So our expectations and our ideas of performance have to be consistent to that. So we can only help this, and I think there is a change. And I was just thinking, sitting in here, that how interesting that an institution like this volunteered to make a sort of outside auditorium. That wouldn't have happened 20 years ago, because everyone said, it's got to be air-conditioned, it's not comfortable, it's not a proper performance space, and look how nice it is. That's not just the architect, that's the client as it were, changing their idea or volunteering to be part of a reconsideration of performance and what they might expect. And those are the things where design, I find this a really nice design idea, because it's not because necessarily of its precise design, but the notion that we're sitting outside in a room which is, I think it's fantastic.
And that introduces my next question really well, because actually there are two parts of this question. One is, when Tim mentioned repurposing and reuse, I would love to hear a little bit from you, because Qatar has been so active in repurposing buildings. And secondly, to echo what David was saying, what can you tell us about the change of taste that you have witnessed in the course of time, especially architectural and design taste in Qatar?
Well, the first part is the reuse. It's very important simply because it's preserving our historical buildings, but reusing them in a way that it keeps the building alive. Sometimes they restore buildings as they are, and I think it's like stuffing an animal. It looks good, but it doesn't have life. But to rehabilitate it, to make a different use. I mean, I experienced this in the firehouse, where we transformed a firehouse into an artist in residence and galleries and so on. It works very well. Now, how did our taste change, or our vision has changed? I have witnessed this in my 30-plus year of career. At the beginning, identity was literal. We have to continue doing what we have done because our history came to a halt when the oil came. That vernacular disappeared. It didn't evolve like other nations in the world. You got the Gothic, and then you had the Renaissance, and then the Bauhaus. And no, here a halt came, and then international style came in with all these boxes. But then eventually, after the 2000, with the invitation of the international master designers coming in, sort of redefined or helped us redefine what our identity or our culture is. That you can translate your culture in a very different manner. Your culture is beyond a skin of a building. It's your environment, it's your surrounding. We gave this place as an example, but the list goes on. Desert Rose or the Ayin Pays Museum, translating it in a totally different thing.
And I think mentioned also sometimes it's not visual. Sometimes it's preserving those elements of traditional architecture. You gave example of the Qatar Foundation headquarters.
Yes.
Rem Koolhaas's building, which is on the outside a box.
Yeah.
A modernist box, but it has some elements in the third.
It has some elements. So I think the direction has really evolved into a very healthy scenario. I think the younger generations, the next generation, are going to be lucky because they're going to build on what they have seen now. My generation had to start from almost scratch to get re-inspired, but things has evolved, and I think you could see with all the new architecture that's coming up, with all the new projects that are coming up, especially government, other than the developers, like David said, you got a red line, you can build that much, it has to be that much leasable for that budget. You end up with this economically driven projects, and these are not necessarily most exciting. We build so much, and then we try to find reasons how to bring people to fill all these buildings. I don't know how sustainable this is, but overall, the cultural projects, the government projects, and the urban planning, I think comparing the downtown, which we call the West Bay, with here, the designer, the master planners did not do or did not think back in the days of creating such a beautiful environment. That's my take on this.
Do you think, David, also that there is now more emphasis on creating urban entities, environments, some master plans for certain areas, than there is an emphasis on individual buildings? So because of this idea that everything that is done should benefit communities.
The problem is we don't have the mechanisms. We've eroded our planning systems. I think that's why this district is so unique.
Yes, I'm speaking from country perspective.
Because the authorities here, the government here, decided to impose an idea of making a piece of city. In most cities, outside of Switzerland, let's say, there isn't a planning authority because we have bought into the idea of the free market. I mean, when you look at the commercial district, it's a very pure expression of market forces, as is now London. It's just, that's what the market does if you leave it alone. And I think that's the issue that we have to think about. But I think that we are learning those lessons. The question is, can we impose them? Can we have, it's an issue of governance more than design, because I think you won't find many architects that disagree with the notion that they would like to build a building within a bigger idea of urbanity or within a bigger idea of protecting environment. I'm sure there are a few architects, I can name a few, but most of them not. So we would all like to be part of that. Again, I would, wearing my optimistic hat, I think the issue of climate change, sustainability, and use of resource, and the consideration of public space, which is part of the, a growing concern, will help us in that, and as will the reuse of buildings. And just on that, I think what's interesting, we know, in a European context, we have for quite a long time refrained from knocking down churches, monumental buildings of significance, even buildings by good architects. We haven't done, for a long time. But the question is, can you protect less significant buildings because they are part of your history? And I think what's very interesting is that we are knocking buildings down of the 60s, 70s, which were not beauties, but it is possible. And that's what I quite like about the NED project, because I would say I get a disproportionate amount of congratulations on that project. I'd love to believe I deserve it all, but I think some of it is to do with people saying, I remember the building before, it was so terrible, and how amazing that you've made a swan out of an ugly duck, let's say. I don't think if we'd built that from new, I would have got so much compliments. And I think that's very interesting, because that's not about traditional architecture in a way. It's about continuity. It's about memory, because all of a sudden, memory of 50 years ago is quite an important memory. We don't all remember the Renaissance, but we remember the 1980s. So I think this is part of meaning as well. And I think this is something that we're starting to learn in the European context, which is that knocking buildings down is not only a problem in terms of sustainability, it's also a problem in terms of urban texture and meaning. And I think now we're getting to the point where that is not just a mission of architects, but I think it's a much more understood, to go to Tim's point, there's a shift in understanding, social understanding in terms of, and by the way, if you want to build sustainably, we don't quite know what it means. We don't know whether that means timber windows or aluminium windows, but what we do know is if you keep a building, you're starting in the sustainability ladder, up here. That's the only thing we know, that if you reuse a building, you're starting ahead of the game. Everything else is a sort of empirical process. We know that there are other rules there, but reusing buildings is absolutely clear. It must be the best way.
I'm going to do something shameless actually now, because as you were talking, David, I was thinking of a building in our country that is a symbol of power, that is the seat of power, that is, by all surveyors' accounts, falling apart and will cost a huge amount to restore, and the restoration is happening, but in the current political, social, economic climate, the full restoration of this building isn't happening, as it should do. The whole idea about architectural taste, Gothic, Neo-Gothic, Pugin, Barry, these are architects who fall in and out of fashion. We've talked about objects and the fetishization of objects. The thing we haven't talked about, and there isn't time at this stage, but is how we fund these initiatives. And that's one of the other things that happens here, is that culture, and therefore by extension design and the initiatives around design and its efficacy, are fully funded In my country, they're not. I run a museum which gets no state funding, or less than 1%. So in order to do that, we have to sell things. So the thing I'm about to show you raises money for the museum. It protects people from the inevitability of London rain, and it makes a statement about how we survey buildings and how we put a finger up to power.
I believe we're out of time, so I just want to ask one final question, which is a continuation of what we've been talking about. And that is, again, you have used technology and you have looked in your latest book in Discovering Arab Deco. You have looked at some styles that have been used in Qatar. I hope we can finish this. And can you just tell us a little bit about possibilities of using technology to preserve cultural heritage, to preserve those buildings that need to be or might be knocked down or might be destroyed because of some other forces?
I mean, there is a lot of technological ways of preserving these buildings, but we scan the buildings and use all the drawings, the results of it, of how to restore it. But now there is a lot of technologies, even to how repair the old concrete. So it's all available and it's doable. And I think this is the same way all these buildings have been restored.
Or reconstructing them in 3D with the use of
3D, and of course then fixing them with the technology that's available.
Thank you very much for this exciting discussion.